Well, Citizenship and Immigration Canada has launched a multilingual ad campaign warning prospective immigrants, permanent residents, and Canadian citizens not to be taken in by crooked immigration consultants. Here's one of the public service announcements. Have a look.
Many Canadians marry people from other countries. Sometimes the marriage is a scheme to jump the immigration queue. Victims are left financially responsible if the spouse goes on welfare. Being a sponsor is no cakewalk. A message from the Government of Canada.
And for more on this, we're joined by Omar Khan. He's a practicing immigration attorney. Omar, the public service announcement we just saw was focused on marriage fraud, but there are other PSAs addressing other forms of immigration fraud. How large is this issue?
Well, it's argumentative. I mean, there's no real hard stats on this, Brad, but the fact of the matter is it is happening. Every immigration lawyer has seen it, and it is heart-wrenching for the victims of this because these people are sponsoring people in good faith, and when they come over here, they're left usually relatively quickly after the marriage, and they're forced to pay spousal support or monies back to the Ontario government if there's any social assistance taken. But the reality is that there's these ghost consultants, what we call them, that are basically in these host countries that are essentially the ones that are predominantly engaging in this kind of activity. And usually what happens is that the people that are engaged in this, it's usually one-sided, but it can be two-sided, meaning that the sponsor is also part of it, although that's not usually the case.
Let me ask you, why do people typically go to an unlicensed immigration consultant? What's the difference in cost? Is that a factor?
Actually, usually people would go to an unlicensed consultant because they wouldn't know they were unlicensed. Sometimes these consultants would hold themselves out to be experts or specialists, and they can use these terms. And obviously, there's no oversight in that use of the term, right?
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But so how do you tell the difference?
You can't. I mean, you can go online to see whether they're registered with either CSIC or the ICCRC or the Relative Law Society. I mean, I'm a member, obviously, of the Law Society of Upper Canada. So you can check that way online. But, I mean, if a person's unlicensed, how many people are really going to go online to really go and do their due diligence, right?
Right. Well, so let's talk about the oversight. Obviously, there's oversight for an attorney.
Yes.
What are the penalties if attorneys mess up?
Oh, they can be pretty severe. I mean, it can result in anything from a suspension, a fine, to an outright disbarment for a lawyer in Canada. Whereas the problem with consultants is that the government has recognized that CSIC, which is the former regulatory body for consultants, they didn't find that they were doing enough to discipline their members, and so they implemented this new group called the ICCRC, which is only 1 year old. They haven't done any kind of complaint analysis as of yet. And, so there's some issue as to whether or not, because this is a new body, whether they have the wherewithal to really go through with this. Obviously, they would say they do.
So essentially, these are immigration consultants with no supervisory body over them, and therefore no penalties?
Well, in a foreign country where you have these ghost consultants holding themselves out to be these experts, absolutely none whatsoever. As far as consultants in Canada go, there is a regulatory body that people, and they have to pay fees for that, but it's in its infancy. So, I mean, the question is whether or not this regulatory body is really capable of overseeing and disciplining members engaging in this kind of conduct.
In other words, if it has teeth, it has baby teeth.
That's correct. And whereas with the Law Society, I mean, obviously they have a very strenuous exercise to be a specialist of any kind of law society. For example, a specialist in immigration. I mean, it's very rigorous. I mean, you have to go through a lot of training to get that kind of a level.
I'm curious to know the costs. Say, for instance, I'm in Canada, my wife's in another country. How much might it typically cost me to bring her here?
It can range. It depends on the country conditions. It depends on how much paperwork is involved. Cost can be anywhere from, say, $2,500 to $5,000, depending upon complexity, really. Sometimes you may have a host that has a criminal record or a bankruptcy that would essentially disbar them from sponsoring, but so you have to go through a lot of other mechanisms. That would increase the cost. And or there could be situations where the sponsored person has some issues that has to be rectified as well. So that's the range.
And finally, that ad that where we began with our conversation concentrates on marriage and fraudulent marriage as part of the immigration fraud issue that Canada is involved in right now. So are those ads helping you?
Oh, these ads are absolutely detrimental to us.
Detrimental?
I would say so, because, I mean, we're all being lumped into this category, right? I mean, it's an attack on lawyers and consultants. And so how do people know what the difference is? How would they know that there's a difference between a member of, say, the Law Society of Upper Canada that's in good standing as opposed to an unlicensed, unregulated person abroad? They wouldn't, right? So, and the fact of the matter is that immigration laws have just become so complex now that applications that I would concede could have been done before by people like regular persons sponsoring cannot be done anymore. I mean, I would submit that it's become so complex that you now need to have, you know, at the very least, a professional to oversee the application process because of the way that the laws have changed and evolved.
So you're saying those ads have actually backfired in some ways?
I would respectfully submit yes. I mean, if you take a look at the website, the CIC website, for example, the government is suggesting that people don't need to use consultants. And so this ad campaign, I would suggest, kind of goes in line with what they're having on their website. However, the fact of the matter is, given the complexity of the way that the laws have changed, you know, like, I'll give you an example. Say you have a scenario.
Quickly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you have an example where a person forgets to add a son or daughter on the application. If that person's unrepresented and they don't know about that, that could be fatal. That can literally stop that person from ever coming into Canada. So, I mean, an innocent mistake made by a person self-represented could be a fatal one, whereas we, of course, would oversee to make sure that doesn't happen.
Omar Khan, a practicing immigration attorney. Omar, thanks very much for coming in to talk to us about this.
Thank you very much.